Hi, this is Sharon Vogernitz, and this is the artifact I have chosen for my class. What this is a table of the number of males and females who've been involved in various committees of the Alberta Teachers Association from 1990-2000 up until last year, which was 2013-14. And the roles that are tracked on this are Provincial Executive Council, which is our elected officials at the provincial level, the executive staff, which are my colleagues, which are hired to work for the association, and at the local level, presidents, secretaries, treasurers, and the important part I want to key on is this part, the bargaining members, Economic Policy Committee, the members of the committee, the negotiating subcommittee, which are the 3 or 4 teachers who actually go meet with the school board to negotiate, and the chairs for the Economic Policy Committee and the negotiating subcommittee. The EPC is a broader committee, usually between 10 and 20 teachers. Joel states that although Cantor's model for identifying sex role stereotyping may seem absurdly obvious, it is a practical and theoretically accessible starting point from which to begin researching gender inequity in bureaucracies. Not that researching gender equity in relation to bureaucracy is simply a task of counting and categorizing. On the contrary, common conceptions about the suitability or predisposition of one sex over another for a given occupation or responsibility are deeply rooted in popular notions about gender roles and widely accepted and vehemently reinforce opinions on sex-gender suitability in the workplace, which makes critical dialogue difficult because it is rife with socio-political cultural complexities. Teachers were leaders in addressing the role of women, particularly in British Columbia and Ontario. As Calder stated, teacher federations are the most active agents. The Federation of Women's Teachers Associations of Ontario, which was the first teacher union in Ontario, was established in 1918 to improve the status of female public or elementary teachers. And in the 1970s, FW was instrumental in the establishment of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. I did my education degree at Western in London, Ontario, and I find the history there interesting. Ontario has more than one professional association or union, unlike Alberta. There's one for high school teachers, Catholic teachers, and francophones. And at the elementary school level, the Ontario Public School Men's Teachers Federation was formed in 1920, shortly after FW, after the male teachers failed to convince women elementary teachers and secondary teachers to establish only one teacher organization. During the years since then, they have argued successfully that male teachers needed higher salaries to provide for their families, and this was the case well into the latter part of the 20th century. In 1972, OPS amended their mandate to accept women and became the Ontario Public School Teachers Federation. And then in 1998, the two elementary organizations merged to establish ETFO, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. I attended a national bargaining meeting shortly after the merger, and I noted that the delegates from ETFO were both women, but they both came into ETFO from the OPSTF, not FW. British Columbia started addressing women's issues in 1969 and established the Status of Women Task Force, which led to BC initiating the first Canadian Teachers Federation Conference on Women's Issues in 1976. Alberta lagged behind. Our first task force was on women in administration, and it was established almost 20 years later in 1989. And gender-related policy was first passed in 1990, not surprisingly, focused on targeting the lack of women in administration. When I started teaching in 1982, the key roles, president, bargaining, were men, and women were secretaries and professional development committee chairs. I got involved in my local in my second year through the Professional Development Committee and as a school representative. And after a few years, I unwittingly challenged the norms when I thought I would run for vice president. Suddenly, in a small local where there had never been an election, the male hierarchy is mobilized to prevent me becoming the vice president. And there's more to that story, but that'll have to wait for another day. Following the Alberta Task Force, the committee that was established was called the Women in Education Committee in 1990. This changed to the Gender Equity in Education Committee in 1998, and the next policies on women's issues were introduced in 1999. This included Policy 5B5. Which states that we believe we should promote the involvement of women in collective bargaining. Over the next 15 years, the number of women involved in collective bargaining was charted. And that was the table I showed you in the beginning. And what I've done is I've turned it into a graph to make it a little easier to follow. So while there were no actual programs to support the policy, the principal action was by staff officers in teacher welfare. There's 6 staff officers in teacher welfare, and what they do is they go out and meet regularly with all teachers in the bargaining units and work with the economic policy committees and the negotiating subcommittees. And what the staff officers did was encourage individual economic policy committees to create policies that would welcome women, such as paying for childcare or planning meetings when it was convenient for women. And also, they specifically invited individual women to participate in bargaining, which is incidentally how I got involved in bargaining myself. And the staffing in teacher welfare has also evolved over the same time period. From all male in 1994, I was hired in 1995, so 1 to 5. It became 3 to 3 in 2008, and the current structure of 4 women and 3 men have been in place since 2011. Unfortunately, overall, women in executive staff, which is his second bullet, actually has declined since the high of 45% in 2002 to the current 39%. But the policy appears to be working in the field. This is Provincial Executive Council, this is executive staff, this is the local presidents, and this is secretaries, and then these bottom 4 charts are the economic policy committees, the chairs, the negotiating subcommittee, and the chairs. And you can see that the participation in women has gone up in most of these over the term of this graph, which is from 1999 to 2012. However, there was a question about whether or not women were interested in bargaining more when there was no actual bargaining, as in the years in between. So when I compare the level on the graph, 2007 is gray. This was the year of the first provincial agreement that went from 2007 to 2012. So there was a fair bit of bargaining that year, but it was restricted to small items because the salary was done at the provincial level. When you look at the yellow lines, which is 2010, this was midstream. There was no big bargaining going on, and the role of the women increased in most of the categories. If you also look, what's interesting is the chairs were the highest in those years. 2012 is when the big agreement expired, and we were now starting a full round of bargaining everything. And if you look at what happens in 2012, well, women are still interested in being on the EPC, it goes up. NSC goes up a little bit. They'll seem to be less interested in being chairs of first of the Economic Policy Committee and even less so of the Negotiating Subcommittee. This kind of trend should have more research. Shifts in approaches to provincial gender policy also started back when the Gender Equity and Education mandate was shifted to become the Diversity, Equity and Human Rights Committee. Well, in some ways, this is progressive. There has been some loss of focus for women's issues. For example, in 2007, Policy 2B13 was added, which seeks the recruitment of more males in education. And in 2008, 2 of the original 3 policies that were aimed at increasing the role of women in administration, they were revised to focus on identifying gender equity and promoting administration to all employees. How much of this is an impact on what Blackmore terms the response to media-generated feminist backlash? What also is the impact of globalization, where Blackmore says women's interests are thus positioned in most instances as against the economic interests of the nation state? In 2014, Policy 5B5, the one promoting the role of women in bargaining, was revised to simply encourage all members to get involved in bargaining. The arguments here seem to focus on the belief that it's no longer necessary to identify gender as a concern, and it reminded me of earlier attempts to change the original women in administration policies, particularly at one annual representative assembly in 1993, which was the only time in my 5 years as a delegate that I actually got up and spoke and in favor of keeping the policy specific to women because, as I said, I had the same pay scale as men, but there were still not enough women in administration to justify watering down the policy. And based on this chart, in a profession that's almost 75% women, I've added the trend line here. This is 75%. So in a profession that's almost 75% women, while there's clearly been some progress in our organization, key leadership roles, both elected in here and staff, well, other than the secretary, are still dominated by men.